William Moultrie, how many of y'all ever heard of him? How many times have you ever heard of Lake Moultrie? Moultrie High School. I mean, there's a lot of Moultrie stuff around here. And I wanted to focus on him because every time we have a lecture, this is lecture number 4, I'd like to try to tag a name of a person to each one of those lectures so that when you think back, you'll think of that person, and that'll be a good place for you to start to build your memory. So tell me, who was the principal person in the first lecture? Can you remember?
James Moore.
Yes, James Moore. He was the leader of the Goose Creek Men. The Goose Creek Men were the powerful group, cadre that ran South Carolina, took over South Carolina, and he ended up being the governor, and his son ended up being the governor too. So James Moore. Who was the second one? The second? George, huh? George Chicken. And he was really so different from Moore. Moore was royalty and very appropriate and very uppity and got things done the way he wanted it done. George Chicken was just a hard-working son of a gun that did great. He ended up in second in command in South Carolina. And then the third was Ghosts and Ghouls. Who do you think is the primary personality in that lecture?
Blackbeard and James Watery.
Blackbeard and Watery Jack, yeah. Blackbeard and Watery Jack, yeah, they're my favorites too. But why do we have all those scary stories? Because you really don't understand the history of a place or a history of a person or a collection of people unless you know what they're afraid of. So out of all those stories, those ghost stories and all that, what were the people in Goose Creek afraid of back in the day, back in the colonial period? Being buried alive, that's right. What's another? Buried alive was a big one. The crazy stuff. Remember Mad Archie Campbell, the crazy stuff from the revolution that was starting up? All the crazy, the love and the hate and everything swirling around. What else were they afraid of besides a premature burial, huh?
Indians.
Yes, Indians, yes. Tell me more about that.
Insurrection.
Huh?
An insurrection.
An insurrection of Indians. Was there a ghost story around that somehow? And then anyway, and then tonight, the person I want you to tag his name and tag that personality to the lecture tonight is William Moultrie, and I think we can start now. Governor William Moultrie, well, we know from that he's a governor. He's a nice-looking guy. He was born right here in Goose Creek. How many knew that? If you look at that map, that's an early map of Goose Creek. See this little stream right here? This is the Goose Creek Bridge. And this is the intersection that takes you out to the college there, that's 78. And then this is Highway 52, is Rivers Avenue today, Rivers Avenue. And this stream right here is Northwoods, Northwoods Mall. You know that water that washes across they have a big canal in there, and then it empties out, it's Steep Brook, it empties out into Goose Creek here. And then you have Trident College, and then this right here, this red star was where he was born and where he was reared. And over here was where he was buried at Windsor Hill. So you can see it's in the same neighborhood, and you think of a man of his background and his talents and his influence he's had on South Carolina and the young nation, you think he would have maybe been farther apart when the whole story was told. But there was a road that was built called what's the name of that road? Ashley Phosphate Road. And which made it was being built when he was being carried out there. So the road to Goose Creek, and then his daddy was a planter as a second career. He was a medical doctor first, but he raised his family right here. This you can see the main road from the Goose Creek Road to his house, and then they had the ornamental gardens. Then you had the other utility buildings, barns and carriage houses and things. And then you had 9 slave houses right there. This was pretty much the way they built plantations back in the colonial period. They all pretty much had the same kind of design. But he was the first, when the first British invasion attempt failed in 1776, word was received that the British would assault Charleston by land and sea. Fort Dorchester was fortified. Captain Francis Marion was ordered to command 2 companies. Captain Benjamin Smith commanded the Goose Creek Company, and General William Moultrie commanded an artillery position on Sullivan's Island. Right there, you can see this is a map. Here's the peninsula of Charleston. And we have some folks here tonight from Sullivan's Island, so you know exactly where that is. He was commanded to come from Fort Johnson across the harbor to this position to protect Charleston Harbor from the invasion of Sir Peter Parker and his British Navy. The first state flag then, this is how significant he is. In 1775, the Revolutionary Council of Safety asked Colonel William Moultrie to design a flag for the South Carolina troops. Moultrie's design used the blue of the militia's uniform and a crescent taken from their cap insignia. It flew at Fort Johnson, then rose above the Palmetto Fort on Sullivan Island. Now you're going to see this flag occurring again and again and again, and that crescent up there coming back again and again and again to haunt you. Because is it a crescent or a gorget? That's the argument and the discussion that's been going on for years and years and years. General Moultrie created a flag with he said, quote, crescent in the upper dexter. He wrote a book, and I've gone back to his book and looked at his book. You can get it in Charleston Library, written by him, and he says this is quoted, a crescent in the upper dexter. And down there on the bottom, I just looked it up, I Googled it, a dexter is towards the right-hand side in a coat of arms. So we're going back to what we talked about in that first lecture when we talked about the coat of arms and the royalty and the crescent moon signifying royalty. And it goes back to when Richard the Lionheart brought back the crescent moon on his dexter, or well, he had it right in the center on his coat of arms back to England. It was a symbol of the second son, because he was the second son. And so I think that kind of starts pulling things together. And then we have this photo that I found, and it shows you the crescent moon and some other white, I guess that's just sunshine flying, coming down on it. But you can see the crescent moon isn't quite a gorget there, it's a crescent. A palmetto tree was added after the war. Sir Peter Parker attack failed, and then we have Francis Marion that really takes the stage after that. And he has the gorget emblem on his hat, the symbol of royalty, because only royalty had armor. If you had to afford armor. Armor was very expensive, and so only the rich, only the people that owned the land, only the royalty had armor. Everybody else just had a stake and just whatever you would wear in the fields. So that emblem, the gorget, however, was worn here. The armor was right here around the neck. You had the helmet, you had this to protect your neck, and then you had all the other armor thing. But when they invented gunpowder, the armor isn't good for anything. Matter of fact, the armor just slows you down after gunpowder and shot is invented. And so they quit wearing the armor, and they took this gorget as a symbol of their royalty. See, I wear armor. I'm really royalty, but I'm just not wearing it today. I'm just going to hang this gorget right there. And that's what they did. And actually, gorgets became things that people would trade. You know, I'll give you a gorget if you give me an animal skin and that kind of thing. And what happens with business people and salesmen when they start selling stuff? The product gets smaller and smaller and smaller, doesn't it? So you had the gorget at first, and then it was a very small, and then finally it was just a pin for the hat. Major General William Moultrie was born in Goose Creek in 1730. He's second in command of Charleston's defenses during the American Revolution. He was taken prisoner when Charleston fell in 1780. He was a member of the Carolina House of Representatives from 83 to 84. He was Lieutenant Governor of South Carolina in 1784 and Governor in 1785. He was elected to the South Carolina Senate in 1787 and was again elected governor in 1792. I don't know anybody that was governor and all that many times. I don't know anybody that's a general and in charge of this and in charge of that and lieutenant governor and governor ever in the history of our state. Maybe there is somebody, but you have to admit he was a highfalutin rascal. Moultrie published a book entitled Memoirs of the American Revolution in 1802. And that explained an awful lot of his beliefs as far as religion and as far as his politics of the day. But what was really starting to sully his last days on earth was an accusation that he had embezzled money. Now, he was a darn good guy as far as I can tell, and a good, honest man. Matter of fact, there's a lot of stories about him giving wagons loads of bushels to the men during the war. He would just give them whatever they needed of his property. And probably the state of South Carolina owed him a lot of money. but it sounds to me as if he was taking money out of the treasury that was not his, and he was going to be charged with embezzlement. So as was the practice of that day, city officials rented small houses near the Charleston jail to sequester those awaiting trial. The house at the corner of Logan and Magazine Streets was rented to house General Moultrie when he was jail-bound for debt. That's in quote. Jail-bound for debt. Now, how come we don't know that? I mean, that's just kind of doing all my papers, reading things, going through stuff, scratching around, reading his book, doing all that. Finally, it came to me, my gosh, this guy was being charged for embezzlement. And I think that probably it was some politics involved. There's always politics involved, and maybe these guys were just being nasty about it. But he was being charged, and he was being held against his will in this house. Now, I had a picture of that house in 1900 when it was being torn down for firewood. That's what the newspaper article said, and I have it quoted in my book, and I have it footnoted in my book, and it tells me what date and time and what newspaper that picture is in, and I haven't been able to track it down, but I'll let you know if I can. But that house, of course, looks like a real nice little house, and it is. That's the house that sits there on the corner of Logan and Magazine Street today. That's where his jail-bound house was. And I bet you those people don't know that they live where the general died. So I know that y'all don't tell them, okay? Might ruin their day. But the general became ill and lay in the side yard portico all night and unto Thursday morning, weakening and fading. Days before, William, the manservant, drew wide the wooden shutters to admit as much of the harbor breeze as possible, but because of the unrelenting humidity, he dragged the soldier, bed and all, onto the little porch aside the garden where the general rested more comfortably. So he was living there with the manservant, waiting for his date to come up in court. Major General William Moultrie died on Thursday, September the 27th, 1805, in a small, rundown, two-story clapboard house on the corner of Magazine and Logan Streets in the jail-bound section of Charleston. His loved ones carried him to the St. Philip's Church, where he stayed that night, and then the next morning the cortege took his body, in a coffin, and started rolling towards Windsor Hill where they were going to bury him. But they didn't want anybody to know where they were going to bury the general, because the rumor of the day, and I understand the behavior of the day, was there were people for pay that would dig up the bodies of newly buried people and hold the body for ransom until debts were paid. So they didn't want anybody to know where he was going to be buried. In his family Bible, it was written that he wants to be buried next to his son, who was a major. And he had died earlier after the Revolutionary War. He had died, but in the family Bible, he had said that he wants to be buried next to his son. So they didn't tell anybody where they were going to bury him, but they took the cortege up what's Highway 52 today. They call it the Road to Goose Creek, to Cypress Gard, actually phosphate. It was just a pathway. It was being developed at the time, to the knoll called Windsor Hill. It was 29 feet in elevation. And he was buried in an unmarked grave on Windsor Hill. I took that photograph where I think years after they dug him up and moved him. I'm going to tell you about that in a minute. And I took that photograph of where that was. William Moultrie was buried on Windsor Hill, but later moved to the St. James Goose Creek churchyard, and soon after, a few remnants were interred at Fort Moultrie. So he was buried in 3 places. He was buried on Windsor Hill. Then the people that owned Windsor, and the people didn't know where he was. A party went out in 1850 to find him because he was the hero of our state. And they went out, this group went out to try to find the old graveyard, and they couldn't find anything. And so they stopped the project. And about 40 years later, they went back out again. Other people went back out again, determined to find William Moultrie's grave. By that time, the plantation was no longer operating as a plantation. There was just a series of farms. But one man said that when he was a boy, he saw a marble slab in the woods. That ended up being the slab of Major Moultrie, his son. And that boy was able to show him when it was, and they had to do some little digging and carrying around and chopping some things down before they found that slab, and they assumed that General Moultrie was buried next to his son, as was his earnest request in the Bible. So they got in touch with the University of South Carolina Department of Archaeology and History. They came down with a team to dig up the grave and move the grave. And why do they want to move the grave? Because the people that owned Windsor Hill, they bought Windsor Hill. It wasn't good for farmland. We can get into that if you want to talk about a real boring topic. It was not good for farmland. It was just broken up to a series of farms. And they went in there and bought it, and they wanted to use the land to sell it to a construction team that was widening out I-26. This was in the mid-1970s. So they dug him up and they moved him over to the St. James Goose Creek Church because that's where the records show that he had attended with his parents. From the time he was a little fat, little red-headed 2-year-old boy sitting on his mama's lap until the time he grew up, that's where they went to church, right here in Goose Creek. And sadly, and this is in the report that team wrote, and you can get it in the library, from the University of South Carolina. They wrote that they took 3 of his bones from his ribs. There was just dark soil. It was like the soil was darker than the other soil around it. They knew that was him. And they said they got down to the brass tacks. When they got down to the brass tacks, that's in the report, they knew that it was the coffin that held the body of General Moultrie. Now, I hope I'm not boring you a little bit too much detail, but they knew by description how the coffin was built. And so they knew when they got down through that down to the coffin, got down to the nails and the tacks, and got down below them, and they got down to the dark soil, is what they called it. That's what they assumed the body of the general was. So they got it all scooped up, got everybody scooped up. They were the Brailsfords, the Ansley family. There were slaves buried there, and his son was buried there, his wife was buried there, and he was buried there. So they got the whole bunch of them, the whole big load of it, and took it over to the St. James Goose Creek Church and buried it there. And that's when they took 3 rib bones, they said about the size of your finger, and they took those 3 bones over to this grave on Sullivan's Island, Fort Moultrie, to bury them there. And the report says, for the tourists. Now, isn't that crummy? I mean, I think that's crummy. The guy is a great hero and a great public servant. He loves his state. He designs our flag. He wants to be buried next to his son. And they're moving his body around. And I just think that's pretty crummy. But that's where he's buried. You can go out there. How many have seen that stuff? And you thought he was buried there. He just has his 3 little bones. And there I am in 1978. Yes? No, I'm not the little guy. The little guy is Harold Dassinger, and his daddy was taking our picture. Harold Dassinger and his daddy, their father and grandfather owned the land there that was next to Windsor Hill. And they called me over at my school. That little boy went to school there, and his daddy said, I'll show you where that grave is. He knew I was interested in it. So he took me out there, and we walked up there, and we found the grave, and I don't know what we intended to do. I was going to see if I could find a brass tack, find something. That would be stealing. I was already trespassing. I thought, well, whatever, go ahead and steal something. But the hole was there where they had moved the grave. At least I can tell you that I was there in 1978, and I'm the guy with the mustache right there. You know why I cut that mustache off? See, you go to the drugstore, you can get this stuff, and you can put it on there, and it takes away the gray. And one morning I was going this, I'm going, what in the world am I doing this for? So I just shaved it off, and that was it. That was 20 years ago. I knew you all wanted to know that. So Windsor Hill, about 3 years ago, looked like this. This is the top, and that was shaved down so that the dirt could be sold and the soil could be sold for the expansion of I-26. And so now I'm going to try to play the video. We're here today at the St. James Goose Creek Church for the St. James Goose Creek Parish that was founded in 1706. And I'd like to focus on the center stone that was moved here from Windsor Hill. The story begins at Windsor Hill, but this stone here, the one marking the grave, Major William Moultrie, and I always thought that was interesting because he was a captain when he died. I think he was given a post-mortem promotion. But he died in 1796. He was a captain in the Revolutionary War, served admirably. And he was the son of the famous South Carolinian that we all know as Major General William Moultrie. The reason that the story starts with him is that he owned Windsor Hill Plantation when he married the lady there. His father wanted to be buried next to his son, and his father was indeed buried next to his son on that plantation graveyard. But strikingly and sadly, the plantation went out of business after the Revolutionary War and could no longer afford to maintain the land as a plantation, selling hundreds of kegs of rice and hundreds of kegs of indigo and hundreds of kegs of navel stores. They couldn't do it, so the plantation just became a place for farms where the servants and the slaves lived independently. And consequently, the gravestone was overgrown. And even though the folks knew, and there's a lot of evidence that the general was buried next to his son at Windsor Hill, they couldn't find the cemetery. They couldn't even find the area that he was buried in. And that was in 1850 when a committee went out searching. So that was a dead end. And that dead end continued on into the 20th century. We are standing on the uppermost top of Windsor Hill. It's 29 feet above sea level. And that may not be a real high hill or whatever, but in South Carolina low country it certainly is, and is known for being visible for miles around. Matter of fact, one commentator said that this was a perfect place to bury Major General William Moultrie because you could see the prominence for miles away as you approached it on Ashley Phosphate Road. What I've also noticed here is this knoll that we call Windsor Hill has gotten not just a haircut, but has been shaved. The top of the head has been taken right out of here because this soil was used was sold to contractors who were expanding I-26 in the late 1970s. And so shortly after, and his son and the Brailsfords and the Ansley families, Terry Stones, were moved out of here, contractors began to move the soil out of this area. It was a rice plantation, and then it failed as a plantation after the Revolutionary War. It was just a farm. So this has had a history across 300 years. Tony's not here. He's a friend of mine, and does these little films for me. Okay, let me try to get the second part of the I can't sneak out of here, that's for sure. Okay, let me see. This goes back to the ghost stories, okay? I'll bring you up afterwards. The records are silent, mute when it comes to a young little 4-year-old child. She lays right here under this ground. The Shire family lived nearby here, and they went to church here at the Bethlehem Baptist Church. And it's interesting, and it should be striking to most, that on her tombstone of this 4-year-old little girl, almost 5 years old, just a couple weeks short of 5, there's a trillium flower engraved in the stone. She died in September of 1859, just before the trilliums come forth. Her spirit remains in this forest because people that live near and visit here will tell you that they've seen the spirit and the shadowy vision of a 4-year-old little girl walking here in the woods. The first time that little girl was seen was right at the end of the 19th century when they were moving the Bethlehem Baptist Church off of these grounds to a new site about 4 miles away. And one of the little boys who was helping them tear down the church and move the church out of this area insisted that he saw a little girl standing here. And so they searched the woods, and they searched the woods because they said she was crying. The little boy said he saw this little girl crying in the woods. And they searched the woods and couldn't find her. But there has been repeated sightings for the last 140 years. And so her spirit dominates this part of South Carolina. And I don't know why her spirit doesn't rest yet, but maybe it'll rest when her church, the Bethlehem Baptist Church is moved back to this site. Isn't that great, that little girl's picture there? Thank you, Tony, again for doing that.
Are there plans to move that church back?
Okay, I'll get into that.
So we're back to the top, right?
Thank you. Could you just get that up? Get it up? Ellen, yeah, that's the St. James Goose Creek Chapel of Ease. It's 4 miles from here. That's where George Chicken had his plantation. He was, remember, he was a deerskin trader with his pack horses, and that's where he would camp because it has water, it has trees, it's a beautiful place to graze your horses. And then he donated 1 acre of land for a chapel, and that chapel was built there. It was built out of bricks in a cruciform shape, and then it's collapsed and everything because of just not being used since the Revolution, because everything English was kicked out. Everything English was sullied back then. We're going to talk about that tonight too when we get into the Revolutionary War. But we're trying to, that church stands. It was moved board by board, and we're trying to figure out how to bring it back. It's just a matter of money, and we do have financial control of the church.
We who?
The committee that is called the St. James Goose Creek Chapel of Ease Committee. And we are a nonprofit with the state of South Carolina, and we received a $105,000 grant. I'm digressing, but you said something, I guess I'm going on. When the South Carolina Department of whatever was expanding the naval base and getting it bigger for the big ships, they needed to mitigate some wetlands, and so they gave us $105,000 if we would put a covenant on it and protect that land in perpetuity. So we're doing that, and we were able to buy the land and get it under our ownership. We have 22 acres there, and it's really great. If somebody wants to go see it sometime, you can go up Old Highway 52, and you'll see the historic marker, or if you call me, I'll meet you, and you can jump in my car, and I'll drive you up there and look around. It's a nice place to visit. I told that story again because we couldn't get it to run during last week when we had the ghosts and goblins, and it's an important story because I made it up. But I made it up, and it's a pretty doggone good story, isn't it? Especially when that little girl comes up like that. I just pulled it out of the blue, but this helped me explain these stories to me. And that's what I was trying to do, because Jim Rozier, who has all my admiration, you saw his image here, who was a wonderful, wonderful man, and he's not with us anymore. He told me he saw that little girl. Because I asked Jim, I said, Jim, he used to live there. He used to live about 200 yards from that place. He said, yeah, Mike, when I went hunting, I would see that little girl once in a while. She was always crying. And he said, my brother raised his rifle up and was going to shoot her. I said, no, you can't. That's a little girl. He thought it was an animal or a deer. And then, and so he saw it. That was in his head as a child growing up in those woods. He saw that little girl. And there's 2 other people, a man and a woman, who also told me they saw that little girl, but they're still alive. So I'm not going to tell their tale until they're gone. I mean, they'll probably outlive me. They're both younger than me, so they'll probably outlive me. But see, Judy, you know George? Yeah, he's one of them. Yeah, yeah. He says he's seen her more than a couple times. So anyway, that's what ghost stories assuage your fears and your feelings. And there was a time after the war when, there was a time when everybody lived together. The white folks, the black folks, and the brown folks, we all lived together. We didn't live equally, but we all lived together. And then after the Civil War, the black folks went there, the white folks went over there, and the brown folks went to Carnes Crossroads. And that's when these communities were being split up and broken down, and churches were being moved, and there was a huge amount of emotion being stirred during that period. And that's what the little girl is upset about. That's that story. Okay, up Goose Creek at the forefront of the American Revolution. I would be a loyalist, knowing what I know about the United States history at that time and the issues. I think I would be a loyalist. I would be loyal to the king. How many of y'all would have been loyalists? And then we're going to go through it and we'll ask you again. Or you would have all been patriots? Matthew, you would have been a patriot? I know it is. This guy here says he was William Rhett. He was 50 years before the American Revolution. He said unless the revolution, that was the Royal Revolution of 1719 he's talking about. Unless the revolution was cropped in bud and examples made of some of them, they, the Goose Creek men, will set up for themselves against His Majesty as well as the proprietors. So that spirit of revolution was there at 1719. The Goose Creek men were leading it. The Royal Revolution, was it led by the dynamic duo, a precursor to the American Revolution, George Chicken and James Moore? I don't think so, but some people theorize that it just is a good precursor of what was going to happen another 40 years. That was down the road. You know, the royalty owning the big pieces of property, and then the up-and-coming middle class guy that has businesses. He was in the deerskin business, and then in the metal trade. And that really did happen. The empire offered many advantages. Goose Creek planters depended upon British markets and made huge fortunes. So they're making lots and lots of money. They came here to make money and to have land and to be able to buy and sell, and they were doing all of that. This is just an old map that points out how close you are to Charleston. It was a close ride to Charleston, and they built these magnificent plantations with beautiful homes, Otranto and Crowfield, the elms. There's a rendering, a diagram or a plat of the elms too that shows how that was laid out, with the main entrance and the big house, and then you had a pleasure garden behind it where you could walk around a fountain, and then they had the well. I know I'm not supposed to come over here like this, but I'm going to do it anyway. Here's the well right there where you would actually go down and walk down into it and get your water and then come back up. And that's interesting. They had that, and that was the common way to put, make water available, potable water near the plantation homes. Medway Plantation, the Hayes, Steep Brook. That was right next to the Moultrie Plantation, Steep Brook. And the Steep Brook that you're talking about is the one that comes through Northwoods Mall. And then it falls and goes real fast into the water. And the richest man in North America lived here. He was 3 times richer than the second richest man, who lived up in Maryland. And so this is a high cotton. And I like this map. It shows the bridge, Goose Creek Bridge. It shows the avenue to the Oaks. And I'm so sad that the old Oaks house is torn down and gone now. It shows the parsonage house. There's apartments are there now. Do you know exactly where the parsonage used to be? They have apartments called the parsonage. I guess it makes sense. And the Goose Creek Church was really, I'm sad to say this, and maybe I'll change my mind someday, but this church was always a political institution, not a religious institution. And I'm not being critical, because I understand it, but even today, it's not a religious institution, because you're not allowed to go there. Okay? Like you would think it's Sunday, let's go to church, or if we're going to have a special Easter Sunday, let's go to church. No, you're not allowed to go there unless you're a vestryman or you're a guest of the vestryman, because it's privately owned. So I'm not being critical. I'm just saying that it has never been a community church that you would identify with. Plantations depended on slavery. Slavery was big business in Africa. Matter of fact, it may have been the biggest business in Africa. Slavery persisted for thousands of years over there. And when the English Empire and the Spanish and the Portuguese Empire and the French began to build empires around the world, and they needed labor, they started buying slaves in Africa. They didn't enslave the slave. They bought slaves that were brought to them and sold to them by other Africans. That's just part of the story we don't hear about. I'm going to say something stupid, and you can quote me. No white man ever enslaved an African. They were already slaves when he bought them. And that's not a play on words. This is a big business in Africa. And they shipped them over to North America. And with guys right here in Goose Creek, John and David Dace of Goose Creek bought and sold slaves. And their plantation, part of their plantation has been developed into Century Aluminum. And their other part of their plantation is being developed into a magnificent park at the old Dennis Field. I hope you all get a chance. The park is going to be opened on November the 11th. And it's called the John McCants Veteran Park. And also recognized at that park is a young man, 19 years old, He's a graduate of Berkeley County Training School. This is back before schools were integrated. And he died in Vietnam. He's a African American boy. He's the only person from this area that died in the Vietnam War. So he's going to be recognized finally too. And I ain't bragging, but I've been trying to get him recognized for about 20 years now. And we're finally getting there. But this is what the English empire builders thought. This is what we needed South Carolina for, you know, gold, grapes, olives, citrus fruit, and silk. That's what we wanted South Carolina to produce, and they didn't produce any of it. There's gold here, but you can spend $1,000 worth of time and effort and labor to dig up $1 worth of gold. They got gold, but it's not enough to make it worthwhile. And why can't we grow this other stuff? We can grow silk here, but it takes a lot of processing, and the last bunch of silk for export before we gave up burned down in a big barn fire. So they just gave up on it. But why don't we grow oranges and grapes and olives? We got nice humidity and nice hot days and sun all over the place and long, long summers and short, short winters. Yeah.
Frost. You get frost 3 to 4 times a year.
Thank you. And all you need is to have a cold day one time and your whole orchard can get wiped out. Then you got to start from scratch. I remember, what's the coldest that you can remember here in South Carolina? Just give me an idea.
19.
Dottie, what's the coldest you can remember?
I'm not sure what the year was, but it was.
What's the temperature?
Oh, I don't remember. It was cold though.
Okay, it was cold, see?
19 degrees I've seen.
19 degrees.
Seen it colder than that.
I've seen it colder than that. What have you seen it?
I've seen 14.
I've seen 14. I've got down to 14. I've been here 50-something years. So it's getting cold, and you only have to get cold one time before your whole
One
orchard.
time when it got down to about -5 back in 1985, January.
I agree. Yes, sir. And I was going to say something close to that, like 7 degrees, I think, but I wasn't going to get into go any further. But I agree with you.
I was in the Navy, and my ship was berthed down at the old Navy base, and that night it was too cold for my men to stand their watches out on the quarterdeck, and I had to have them move into the captain's passageway and just crack the door and kind of peek out and keep their eye on the quarterdeck.
And
Inhumane.
yes.
It was supposed to be.
Well, that toughens them up, though. I'm just teasing you. I'm trying to. But yeah, you don't even need to have it freeze. You know, if you get down to 40 degrees, your orange trees are all going to die. And then you got to start all over with. So the heck with that. They'll import oranges and stuff, and they'll grow something else and make the money something else. And I just copied this is right off the record. 1745, rice, pitch, tar, turpentine skins, corn and peas, beef and pork. And none of those things that I listed earlier are cited up there. These are the exports exported from Charlestown in 1745. Rice dominated. Spring Grove. I'm going to give you a free book if you can tell me why these rice fields have those 90-degree angles. Why didn't they just have ponds? Why, see all these 90-degree angles? I'm going to go to another one. Here, there's squares and rectangles. Here's a rice field that's been growing over. Here's one. See them along the side? This is crowfield. You see how they're all put into segments? See how this is a rectangle? This one's like a trapezoid, but it's almost a big rectangle.
They had to maintain a certain depth.
What?
Maintain a certain depth.
Depth, that's right. You could have a certain depth in a pond, but if you go here, now you're going to have another depth. Are you going to go up? You're going to go down. And you got to run a line across those angles. You got to run a line to make sure that the ground is the same level everywhere. And you can do that if you have 90-degree angles or 45-degree angles. If you just have the natural flow, you're never going to have the same depth. And I don't want to waste your time talking about hydroculture, but it was the essence of rice growing here. You can open up the gate, or at first they just threw the seed out and let it grow and go in there and weed it out and tell you poor old slaves got to go in there and find the weeds and look at that's a weed and that's not, and take care of it and plow it up. Really, really labor intensive. But if you could just flow water in there and let the water come up, say 4 inches and kill the weeds, then let it go down and then grow the rice for a while, and if you get weeds again, let the water come back in and hold it for a few days and then let it go. That's how they made so much money. There was nothing nice about rice culture. You made money off the backs of slaves. It looked like a beautiful place to work. It was not. It was hot and miserable. And this magnificent woman, Alice Hugie Ravenel Smith, made these paintings. And I'm probably violating some kind of a royalty by showing them to you, but just don't tell anybody, okay? The Oaks. Richmond, that really shows that. Richmond is part of George Chicken's plantation. It was right next to it, and right next to where that chapel was. You can see they have squares and straight lines. The Goose Creek economy depended on slave labor. These are government employees. That's a joke, okay? You know, one working, one watching, get it? All right. It's not that funny, is it? And then winnowing baskets, winnowing barns. You know how this works, a winnowing barn? You carry the rice in bags up to the top, then you open up a little trap door in the middle there, and you let the rice fall a little bit at a time, a little bit at a time, and you collect it in baskets underneath. But as it falls, the wind will blow the chaff away, and it cleans it that way. And I just put these guys' names, 64 slaves worked at Howe Hall, is because you never, hardly ever get the name of the slave. And they're just like invisible people. But they're actually human beings that worked and lived their lives here in South Carolina. And I try to list them in my work and at least have their name. And in this case, boy, it's raining out there, isn't it? And aren't you glad you all came to a lecture? You wouldn't want to be home watching TV with having a nice cool drink, would you? And so anyway, Sambo, Tom Holly, Caesar, Scipio, the oxen drivers. Oxen were bred to pull sleds and logs out of the New World forest, clearing fields for corn or rice. And older workers such as Kumba, Jupiter, Jackie, and Wassa attended to horses, cows, sheep, and hogs. So there was plenty of water in Goose Creek, and you know that. There's a lot of little bridges and little canals. Another thing that they started growing here that was being experimented in other parts of the world, such as Portugal, but they brought it here, was red dye. They called it madder, but you got a red dye from it. It was not very successful, but they tried really hard to make something of it. Indigo dye was what we really made our money on. That's the blue color that William Moultrie uniforms and the flag is made out of, that same navy blue color. And this is the ruins in Otranto, and we'll come back to that in a little bit. But preparing the ground for indigo, a lot of labor, a lot of hard work, but it's a whole lot cheaper to harvest than things like tea. And we'll get into that in a minute, why we ended up with indigo and rice and stuff like that. Cutting and gathering. You see how they're cutting the whole thing down and gathering it? With tea, you have to walk through there and look and pull the tea leaf off and put it here. You got to have eyes, you got to have a brain, you got it down here. Instead of just cutting the whole thing down, it's a lot cheaper to do it this way. Otranto was produced at indigo. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to say at. I mean, that. Lord William Campbell, last royal governor, married Sarah Izard of the Elms and was a Goose Creek landowner. The slides that we missed, I'm so sorry, I just can't seem to understand how to work this. They were the royalty, and they believed that they were descendants of the king. They were Norman. They had Norman blood, not the crude blood from the north, the frozen north, which is England and Scotland. They had the Norman blood from France, and they had a very high opinion of themselves. And they lived right here in Goose Creek. Matter of fact, right here where we're standing, well, he's the last royal. He married Sarah Izard of the Elms Plantation, but he lived right here where we're standing. Goose Creek planters developed varying dependencies and loyalties. That's what led to war. Some planters identified with northern protests against taxation. Some planters were planter merchants who were locally annoyed by the new regulations and taxes. Some Goose Creek personally identified with the artisans and mechanics who led the protest in Charleston. Generally speaking, the royalty and the people that owned the land stayed loyal to the king all the way through the process. It was the new group, the new strata of workers, whether they were blacksmiths, whether they were shoemakers, whether they were whatever, the people that delivered products, made newspapers, whatever. They were the ones that ended up having to pay more taxes, and they were the ones that were pro-independence. Why did England tax the American colonies? The French were out there in around the Mississippi River, and the Indians were out there too, and these guys in the colonies, including South Carolina, kept going west for more land, kept going west. And you get out there and you end up in a fight, in a war, and we ended up in a war called the French and Indian War in 1754. It lasted in our country 7 years, and it lasted over in Europe 9 years. It started here in 1754 and went until 1763. So is that 7? Oh, that's 9, isn't it? 9 years. So it lasted 9 years here. Okay. And it was very expensive. The English had to send soldiers and arms over here and naval ships to try to defend the country from the French and the Indians. It spread over to Europe, and so it was incredibly expensive. They kept telling these American guys, do not go west, do not go over the mountains. We have a line called the Proclamation Line of 1765. Do not go over that and go settle it. So what do you think Daniel Boone did? Well, he did, went over there into Tennessee and settled it, started causing some of the trouble. So they spent a lot of money, and they thought it was sensible, if we're going to station English soldiers over here in the 13 colonies to protect these knuckleheads from the French, then we need to tax them. And that's what they did. King George III personified the conflict. Now, he looks like he needs to be beat up at recess, doesn't he? He's just asking for it, isn't he? You know, like his mother dressed him like that, sent him to school. Mob action against the 99th Regiment erupted in 1770 in Boston. Paul Revere circulated the following image. And I had to do a paper on this in my undergraduate studies and found out a few things. I was fascinated by it. I'm going to point out a few things here that will help you understand the Revolutionary War. Paul Revere was a kind of a rich kid. He made things for you, put like false teeth and things like that. He worked with metals. He used metal plates to produce pictures and to multiply like papers and things. And so he had like a distribution of a circulation business. And this happened in 1770s. And every morning, at about 8 o'clock, the British would come out and march. You got to get, bend the legs and get moving a little bit, check your rifles out, and march down the streets. And then people would holler insults at them because they were these soldiers from England over in the 13 colonies. A lot of people didn't like that. A lot of people liked it. It was fine, but a lot of people did not. So they would cause trouble, and they did things like throw snowballs. And sometimes the snowballs had rocks and other debris in it. And so it got to be testy. And Paul Revere created this image and circulated it throughout the 13 colonies, and it looked one-sided. Here comes the British. The bell on the church began to bang. That was a sign that there was a fire. When the bell begins to bang, 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 it means fire. Somebody screamed fire, and the guy's fired. And how many people you think died? 3, yes, 3 of them, yes. 1 that day and 2 that night died. But look at this. I just put these little arrows on there that I just saw getting ready for you all. Look at the crescent moon up there at the upper right Dexter. That's where our flag has the moon. Does that mean anything, or is that just coincidence that he just had a moon in the same place that South Carolina has their flag? Also, the church steeple was where the order to fire came from. And look at the only words in this picture is that third arrow. And what does it say? Butcher. Butcher. It says butcher. So he's planting subliminal ideas into the mind of the viewer. Typical guy. And the guy that directed the people to come down to the fight stood over here by the church, and I think he was the one responsible for getting the church bells to ring. And they said he looked like that he had a long white beard and he was wearing red, like Santa Claus. And that's just coincidence. They didn't have Santa Claus like that back then. But he was there, and I think that was Sam Adams that was stirring up that trouble. But this spread throughout the 13 colonies, all over the 13 colonies, and this frustration and annoyance turned into anger, and turned into fear, and turned into hate. Boston Tea Party was 3 years later. They went on the ships and threw the tea overboard. And then we had the same situation in Charleston, but we didn't throw the tea overboard. We just stole all the tea and put it in a warehouse and sold it later on and used it to help pay for the war. Those were the tea protests. I'm going to move along pretty quick here. Well, let me go back if I can. No, I don't know why I cannot go back on this thing. Whew, there is no going back, is there? What was I going to talk about there, Vanderdussen? You see where Vanderdussen's? This plantation right down here? Remember that story about if you come, old what they call, not Vanderdussen, but old would get you. Can you remember from last week? Alexander Vanderdussen, he was the cruel master from that plantation, but I was trying to go back and talk about something. The first attempt failed in 1776, and the British tried to assault. Fort Dorchester was fortified. Francis Marion was ordered to command 2 companies. Captain Benjamin Smith was from Hall Hall. He commanded the Goose Creek Company, and the assault was repulsed by General William Moultrie's command of the Little Palmetto Fort on Sullivan's Island. Springfield Plantation is where Boulder Bluff is. Boulder Bluff and Beverly Hills, in that area, right behind here. That's where Springfield was, and one of the relatives said he wrote, I saw his letters down, a collection of his letters. He says, I am now at Cousin Alexander's house at Goose Creek. I pass my time more agreeably than I can in Charleston, which now has the most melancholy appearance. Stephen Mazik lamented. He was the same guy that was visiting his uncle here at Boulder Bluff, Springfield Plantation. He said, the whole Providence is in such a melancholy, disturbed situation that there is no peace, satisfaction, or happiness to be enjoyed, not even at the church. Reverend Edward Ellington recited that it may please thee to bless and preserve our sovereign Lord, King George. The response was supposed to be, we beseech thee to hear us, good Lord. Instead, there was silence, and finally a loud voice boomed, good Lord, deliver us. Lots of hate, lots of angst, lots of anger. The church was a royal institution. We talked about that maybe last time or the time before. It was never really the kind of church that you and I think, I'm not talking bad to Anglicans or Episcopalians or anything, but it represented the government at the time. And it was an institutional sign of obedience to the king. The Royal Hanover King George coat of arms is displayed over the altar of the Goose Creek Church. One church minister threatened the minister that if he called for the blessing upon the king, he would throw his prayer book at him. The promise was kept, and the minister canceled services after the book came flying across the church. He excused everybody. The church reopened as a loyalist institution after the British occupied Charleston in 1780. And then they came roaring back in and took Charleston in 1780. Sir Henry Clinton led that, and he brought in 10,000 troops around the Charleston and was able to come in from all different directions and starve out the defense, the patriots that were trying to defend the peninsula. And this guy was a real character, Colonel Bannister Tarleton. He came up at the Goose Creek, and the men here in Goose Creek camped out in the Oaks plantation and around the church, and there was a school there. They camped out, and they slept in the school, and they camped out on the grounds, and got ready to move towards Monk's Corner. Clinton bombarded the town until General Lincoln surrendered his army. Goose Creek during the occupation of Charleston by the British military. Okay, now, do you all have any questions? We've been at it for about an hour. We got another 3 hours of this stuff, and I'm bored already. I really am. I mean, maybe we could do 20 more minutes at the max. You know, this guy's fighting this guy and that kind of stuff. But next week is really good. We get into the Civil War, and then I'm thinking, my gosh, we go from the overthrow, the proprietors, the first war in 1719, and then we go to the Revolutionary War, and then we go to the Civil War. It seems like our history is nothing but a bunch of wars, a series of wars. Why? Can't we do better than that as a nation than just go from war to war? And do you feel like maybe we're getting closer to a war right now? So what part of culture, what kind of this culture that we come up in? Okay, there, Goose Creek. What was going on in Goose Creek while Charleston was occupied by the British? Charleston, probably the greatest British victory of the war. That's what the leading general said. The greatest victory of the Revolutionary War was when they took over Charleston. The British controlled the countryside using the Oaks. Some Goose Creekers remained neutral, some acquiesced, like the owner of the Oaks plantation, Edward Middleton. He accepted the protection of the king, and that was a nice way to say, I surrender. I'll do what you want me to do. He accepted the protection of the king, and his son, you know his son's name? Arthur Middleton was a signer of the Declaration of Independence. So the family was divided, and there was an awful lot of angst and anger between families and within families. Some joined the resistance and some were imprisoned. Henry Middleton and John Dace accepted the protection of the king. John Dace owned where the aluminum plant is, Century Aluminum. That was his plantation out there, and a lot of that Mount Holly area. John Dace accepted the protection of the king. The British controlled the Goose Creek Bridge and the roadways. British camped. This is just a picture of tents, but they did have tents when they camped there in Goose Creek near the near the Oaks plantation home, at their school, and by their church. And then at Yeaman's Hall, this lady, the daughter that was there at the time, she wrote a book, and it's worth reading. It's a good book. She wrote, raising my eyes ever and anon to look down that dark and silent Goose Creek Avenue, my thoughts would run upon olden stories, and all night there rang in my ears the blast of bugles, the clatter of galloping steeds, with the shouts of fierce riders bursting in one wild torrent upon us. The Hayes home by John Parker, I like this story. He had his home fortified so he could withstand attacks by Indians, but he was fortified aptly so during the Revolutionary War too. But one day while his wife was sitting by a window, a musket ball came flying through there, and he went and grabbed his rifle or his musket, and he shot two and killed one of these guys on his property. They were both English soldiers that were just out ransacking places. So he immediately buried one of them right where he died, and the other one ran off. And then he wrote a letter to the general in charge and told him what happened. And the general wrote back, I am, sir, very glad of it. So they wanted peace in the countryside too, and they didn't want to lose control of their army. Rollin Lowndes was elected president of South Carolina. He succeeded John Rutledge when Charleston was sieged. He sent his family to Crowfield for safety. His wife, Sarah Lowndes, that's what I was going to say earlier with William Johnson. He said, okay, hon, I'm going to go fight down here in Charleston. You stay here with the kids. We got 3 boys and a girl, and we got these 26 slaves. You guys stay right here, and I'll let you know when we get down. I'll come back. Now, isn't that just nonsense? You put the woman in charge? I'm not saying it's nonsense to put the women in charge, but aren't you just... I don't understand how they can even walk away and leave their whole family just there. See ya, if I get back, I'll see you later. Same thing happened with Sarah Lowndes. She lived at Crowfield Plantation, and she said she was often alarmed. This is letters that she wrote, and she wrote a memoir. That's why we have this. She said, I am often alarmed and sometimes a good deal frightened. There are vast numbers of plunderers up this way. A large party came here yesterday. So it wasn't just the Hayes with John Parker where people were coming around and plundering and stealing livestock and taking whatever they wanted. It was happening at Crowfield too. On one occasion, the remarkable woman told the raiders that they would receive nothing except that which she willingly gave. She cooked and served breakfast with, quote, plenty of drink, and dismissed them in a short time later. Rollin Lowndes was paroled and complained to the British commander about the treatment of his wife and family. And they had the same situation with Thomas Smith at Bloomfield. He had mixed loyalties. When it erupted, Smith retired to Broome Hall. After the war, he wrote his cousin that he was truly in the way of both parties, causing distress and trouble for both himself and his family. He stated that his estate suffered at the hands of marauders. And then we had the Black Dragoons, which were the British team of British cavalry that swarmed this area, and they were highly efficient soldiers and cavalrymen. And they say they came into Goose Creek destroying property. One resident reported that Smith provided funds for the Loyalist Regiment during the British occupation, but Smith successfully defended himself against accusations, and his name does not appear on the confiscation list. So very quickly we have caricatures of Francis Marion, Thomas Sumter. These are the famous warriors for South Carolina during the Revolutionary War. Peter Oree, Benjamin Huger. And this is an interesting picture. British Colonel Bannister Tarleton claimed regarding Francis Marion, as for that damned fox, the devil himself could not catch him. Now this I thought was pretty interesting, and Judy, maybe you can help me with this one coming up. In 2006, President George Bush recognized Oscar Marion as an African-American patriot. Now, I don't know how to go back with this. See, it won't let me go back. It just goes forward. Yeah, can we go back? I wanted to reset. Okay. Your servant, if you have a horse, your servant's first responsibility is to maintain the horse for you. If you stop and get off your horse, you hand the rein to your servant. And he'll stand there, and then he waters the horse, takes care of the horse, any kind of problem the horse has, and then he delivers that horse back to you whenever you want it or need it. In this picture, George Bush awarded the wrong person. They awarded the guy down there with the sweet potatoes instead of the one standing in the back with the horse. Judy, what do you think? Is that just my imagination?
No, that's the way the picture looks.
That's the way the picture looks. Do you think that's... I guess I just need to shut up, huh? Well, she runs the museum. That's why I'm telling Judy, you need to fix that. Huh? Oh, that's right. Yeah, well, yeah, our sheriff, yeah, fix that, sheriff, will you? Okay. He got nothing else to do, and the largest county in the state, we're bigger than the entire state of Rhode Island, and he's going to work on that problem with it. You see him back there behind, Francis, standing in the back he's right next to the horse. And who's he looking at? He's looking at Francis Marion. That's the guy he works for. That's the guy he reports to. That's the guy he's responsible for. Now the other guy is down there preparing the sweet potatoes. Anyway, that was George Bush. There he is. And he's getting the sweet potatoes, so I don't think that he's the one that should have been awarded, recognized by African American patriot. Francis Marion is the guy that we recognize mostly for his outstanding leadership of the resistance. He started off with about 20 men, and it grew to over 200 men. But for about the first 6 or 8 months, he had 20 to 70 men. And he would go from plantation to plantation. One, at Back Rivers Plantation, it was owned by John Ball, and that's the picture that you have in your museum, Judy. And Francis Marion stole John Ball's horse, and that's the horse that he rode. And he named his horse Ball. Just kind of, just get him every time you get on.
Where was this Back River?
Do you know where Cypress Garden Road is? And you know where Cypress Garden Road ends at Durham Creek? Well, if you stand at Durham Creek and look back south, that's Ball's Plantation. Yeah, you can. Yeah, you got water in front of you. Durham Creek comes in from Cooper River. Then you got the bridge. If you're standing on the bridge, Durham Creek is running under you, and it runs into Chicken Creek, and then in the Back River. Right there is Ball's Plantation, there, over there. And I thought this would help. Well, here's all the waterways down here. And there is the main house up here. There's another house with slave quarters. And then here's another house. Either this is Ball's house there or that's Ball's house. But he named his horse Ball. And he kept it. It was a good, reliable steed throughout the rest of the campaign. Oh, this is another thing I thought was interesting with Francis Marion. He got into a lot of trouble from his boss, Rutledge, General Rutledge, who became our first governor of South Carolina. But his job was to keep supplies from coming into Charleston. Most of the supplies were going into Charleston from, where do you think? Goose Creek. They're coming across the Goose Creek Bridge and going down, well, we got Rivers Avenue today, and they're going every day. There was a guy, I forget his name, but he would collect horses at the 18-mile house and then drive those horses down to Charleston, or he would have horses and get cattle and drive cattle down to Charleston. And it was Francis Marion's job to stop that from going on. General Nathaniel Greene chided Marion for constant flow of supplies into British-controlled Charleston. Marion wrote Peter Oree, "No boats or persons should pass without my passport." Marion later ordered that no one may thrash or beat out any rice but what may be necessary for home use. His challenges continued. Greene wrote to Marion that smuggling was reflecting poorly on Marion and his men. I never would think Francis Marion would be chastened by anybody, would you? Because he's our hero. But he was in trouble. Marion expressed his frustration with persistent smuggling and suggested that he would have to imprison everyone in Goose Creek to halt the flow. Marion ordered his men to prevent women and others from going to town by confiscating their horses and making them return by foot. So he had a tough job, and he's our hero, but he wasn't perfect. I like putting that in there. And then we got some support by Hampton, General Hampton. What does it say? At 81, Goose Creek and Charleston were in British control, but American General Nathaniel Greene agreed with General Thomas Sumter's plan to retake the Low Country. It came across Four Hole Swamp. That's a picture of him in 1930. But here's Lieutenant Colonel Hampton when he came into Goose Creek from the west, and he surrounded the Goose Creek Church while it was in session, and he arrested all the men in there, and then he made them take an oath that they wouldn't fight anymore, and then he paroled them, and then he took off for Charleston and went down to Charleston. He stopped around where the base is today, Navy base, and then turned around and came back up because they started getting too much resistance. Thomas Sumter sent his troops along the approaches of Charleston to harass at every opportunity. And then the dog days is in summertime when it's hot as heck, but they call it dog days because the Sirius star rises up in midsummer, and it's the symbol of a dog. But they called it the raids of dog days. And Henry Hampton's brother Wade rushed over Ancrum Bridge. You know where Ancrum Bridge is in College Park Road? College Park Road, just before you get to the intersection there. The big intersection, I-26, is Ancrum Bridge. He rushed over Ancrum Bridge and along the old Latson Road to Dorchester and seized the Goose Creek Bridge on Sunday morning, July 15th.
The bridge you had a picture of with a candle on top of it. Where's that at?
Four Hole Swamp.
Where?
78.
Is that on, State Road?
No, that is not on State Road. Four Hole Swamp is next to Dean Swamp, right? And that is west of Wassamasaw on 176. Wait a minute, you are the expert on roads, man. This is your territory. Don't ask me questions like that.
Four Hole Swamp is a long swamp that runs from Edisto all the way.
Edisto and the upper waters of Edisto, the upper waters of Ashley River, and then Four Hole Swamp, and that ends up flowing into Wassamasaw. No, that's too far west. It's the headwaters for the Edisto and the Ashley, right?
Wassamasaw is right there, just past Coopersville Road.
Yes, that's too far south for what we're talking about. But I had in 1930 there was a picture of the plaque that's on the bridge. It's on that bridge still. I went out and looked at it about maybe 15, 20 years ago. It was still there. So if you got nothing to do, go look for that plaque. Dog Day raids. Yesterday I received a letter from Major Call at Smith's in Goose Creek. By his account, he expects that the enemy is out, but I have heard that no troops are out. I have certain intelligence that steps are still taken to evacuate. If you cavalry will take post on Goose Creek, it will secure my right, and I'll have the better opportunity to shut up my left their being so near to your front, it would prevent every necessary from being carried to town. That was their plan. Okay, I think I've about had enough of this. Let me see. I got another hour or so here. This guy at Otranto, Goose Creek after the, this is where I was going to end anyway. And if you really, really love this presentation, then we can start next week here, Goose Creek during their occupation. But I'd love to just start right into everything leading up to the Civil War, because that's a very, very interesting lesson, very lecture. And there was a lot of activity right here, and there's some outstanding personalities. Porcher, Robert Porcher, that owned the Otranto plantation, he was 50 years old. He was too old to go off to fight for the Confederacy, so he became the commander of the Home Guard, which means he was in charge of about 50 men who were crippled, too young or too old to fight, or for some reason couldn't march off. So he was in charge. He was the sheriff. He was the county supervisor. He was everything that he was, every military defense. He was everything this entire county depended on. And I'm going to talk a lot about him and show you a lot of things that he did. And then there's the guy that comes to Goose Creek. He's a doctor, but because there's no battles being fought in Goose Creek, he gets 6 men to follow him, and he goes from plantation to plantation to set the slaves free. And I just about get choked up when I read. He kept a diary, so I could read his diary every night. He'd go home and he'd write it. And the way he interacted with these slaves gets me kind of choked up when I would read the thing. I have tears in my eyes. He would call the slaves together and give them a speech and tell them that Moss Lincoln has freed everybody. And then, but he would say, stay here and work and get these crops in and take care of the house. Don't be running off because Charleston can't take care of you. But the people would go up and touch him, make sure he's really a real person. He really did set me free. And it's a wonderful story, and I think next week we can talk about that and go into the Civil War in Goose Creek. It's very humanistic. Okay, any questions, folks? Were you glad you came?
Yeah.
It's raining too hard to leave.
Yeah? You want me to tell you jokes or anything? What?
When Barbados decided to go totally to sugar for production of rum and other things, they cut down all their trees in order to raise sugar cane, and they were importing lumber primarily from South Carolina. Was that wood coming from this area or some other place? I was at Dr. Butler's presentation one day, and he was going through documents, and I can remember seeing an amazing amount of wood coming through, some of it being milled in Charleston by windmills that were actually turning saws. They were loading it up on boats.
Sir, I'm so sorry. I don't know.
Okay.
I know Barbados was growing tobacco at first,
Right.
and then they were making more money on rum.
Money and sugar.
And more money in sugar and rum, that's right. So they switched over, but where they were getting there, and there's not much timber to speak of in Barbados because there's not much rain. I mean, there's no rivers anywhere. And I talked with their Secretary of State from Barbados one time. He said they depend on the good Lord's gifts from above. That's where their water system comes. They don't have rivers or springs or all that. Well, it's a great question. I wish I could have answered it.
I get an answer, I'll tell you.
Thank you. And who's this man that was talking to you, professor of history?
It was Dr. Butler, Ned Butler.
Oh, I know
He's a
Dr.
historian.
Yeah, Dr. Butler, the historian. I've met him and I admire him very much. Yeah, yeah, he's a professional.
Correct.
I'm a retired elementary school principal. Okay, it's a big difference there. Yes, sir.
The oil, was there a big transition once the war was won by the rebels?
No,
So the plantation owners didn't sell out?
no. Matter of fact, Ralph Izard, who was on the first name basis with Thomas Jefferson and wrote letters back and forth to Thomas Jefferson, he said the greatest problem we have in this area after the Revolutionary War was the hate and the angst and the distrust between families and within families. He said both of that. And so it took a long time for them to trust each other, and I'm still not sure that I trust some of them. You know? You know, they're from, I'm here from somewhere else. I'm from off, okay, and came here. And the people that live here are strange to me, you know, when I first got here. Now I've just sort of fit right in, and I'm one of the strange ones. But people in South Carolina, and what did my friend say? How are Charlestonians like the Chinese? They eat lots of rice and worship their ancestors, right? There's still that strong sense of royalty. My ancestor was a royalty. My ancestor was close to the king. My ancestor owned the land out here. I'm something, and you're not. That was still, when I got here, I got that idea from Charleston, and I think that still pervades today. Well, when I said that you can't go to the St. James Goose Creek Church, because the people that are descendants from the original vestry own it, and you're not welcome. And it still prevails, see? I'm glad you asked me that. Okay, anything else? Wow, no hard questions. Well, thank you so much. Please come back next week. The Civil War in Goose Creek is really a good story. Well, you're very kind. Thank you.